The VIP ward confrontation. Benjamin Turner stood frozen in the polished hallway of the 12th floor, his thin fingers still curled around the air where his notebook had been a second ago. The head nurse loomed over him, her white shoes planted like a barrier between him and the window of the VIP suite. Her voice cut through the quiet corridor, sharp and cold, as if the walls themselves needed to be reminded who belonged here and who didn't. She leaned down just enough to make sure he felt small and said, in a tone dripping with contempt, that someone like him had no place on this floor. She jabbed a finger toward the glass behind her, where the shadows of machines and medical staff flickered against the blind. Inside that room, she reminded him, lay a man worth billions of dollars, the most important patient this hospital had ever treated. She made it sound like the money itself was part of his vital signs, as if the heart monitor should display his net worth alongside his pulse. To her, the equation was simple. Important men in expensive rooms belonged here. A security guard's disabled son did not. Benjamin's cheeks burned, though he kept his eyes fixed on the floor tiles, tracing the faint patterns in the marble to keep from being overwhelmed. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and floor polish, but beneath that, he could still detect the faint chemical note that had brought him here in the first place. It buzzed at the edge of his senses, wrong and familiar, like a memory he wished he could forget. He tried to speak, to explain that he wasn't here out of curiosity, that he wasn't treating the man inside like a spectacle. He was here because he knew something was terribly, dangerously off. Before he could get a word out, the nurse snatched the worn notebook from his trembling hands. The movement was sudden and violent, like a door slamming in a storm. She didn't even glance at the pages filled with dense notes, diagrams, and references he had painstakingly collected over years of night after night reading. Instead, she hurled the notebook down the gleaming corridor with all the force of her anger and authority. It struck the wall with a dull, echoing thud, then burst open, pages tearing free and skidding across the floor like scattered feathers. Benjamin flinched at the sound, his chest tightening. Those pages weren't just notes. They were his map of a world that rarely made sense, the one place where patterns stayed steady and predictable. He watched them drift and slide under the harsh lights, suddenly far out of reach, and his breathing hitched. Behind the nurse's rigid silhouette, through the window, the man on the bed jerked violently, his body arching in a frightening rhythm that Benjamin recognized all too well. The machines around the bed screamed in discordant alarm, and doctors clustered closer, their movements frantic despite their expensive training. Benjamin saw the grayness of the man's skin, that particular lifeless shade that meant something far worse than simple illness. He saw the darkened lips, the irregular surges on the heart monitor, the way the medical team moved with confident hands but anxious eyes. He knew that look. He had seen it before, on a different floor in a different room years ago. It was the look of professionals who had run out of explanations but didn't want to admit it. It was the look of people who were losing a battle they didn't yet understand. Christmas Eve, 2 different worlds. On the night everything changed, the hospital might as well have been 2 different planets stacked on top of each other. 12 floors up, on the glittering 12th floor, the Christmas Eve gala was in full swing. A live string quartet played polished holiday arrangements while waiters in crisp black uniforms glided through the ballroom, balancing trays of champagne that cost more per glass than some families spent on groceries in a week. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos clustered in small, gleaming groups, trading polished laughter and practiced smiles under chandeliers that scattered light like crushed diamonds. At the center of it all stood Charles Whitfield, a billionaire dressed in a perfectly cut Tom Ford suit that sat on his shoulders like armor. 2 luxury watches flashed on his wrists whenever he raised his hand, each one more expensive than most people's cars. He lifted a crystal glass of rare whiskey as cameras and phones rose in unison, hungry for the perfect shot. When he stepped up to the microphone, the room quieted with the smooth, rehearsed ease of people who knew when to perform their admiration. Whitfield's voice flowed easily through the hall as he announced a massive pledge to pediatric cancer research, his words carefully crafted to sound generous, visionary, and compassionate. Every pause, every smile, every gesture had been polished for maximum impact. The crowd responded right on cue, erupting into applause so loud it seemed to vibrate in the crystal. Flash after flash burst from phones and cameras, capturing him in that perfect moment. The kind-hearted billionaire, the savior of children, the man who cared. Yet above the applause and the glitter, there was a layer of truth no one in that ballroom could hear. Earlier that same afternoon, in a quiet meeting room far away from the clinking glassware and polite laughter, Whitfield had calmly signed off on killing several rare disease research projects. The equations on the documents were simple: patient populations too small, expected profits too low, long-term returns not worth the investment. The words were clean and clinical, but the meaning underneath was brutal. People with those conditions would stay invisible, untreated, and unheard because they did not fit the balance sheet. While the party shimmered above 12 floors down, the air felt completely different. In the maintenance basement, fluorescent lights hummed faintly and the walls carried the tired smell of old pipes, dust, and burned coffee. There was no polished music here, no glint of crystal, just the low buzz of machinery and the soft crackle of aging vents. This was where the people who kept the building running spent their nights. Security officers, maintenance workers, janitors, the ones no camera ever turned toward. Benjamin sat there with his father in that forgotten space, the cold floor under his feet and a thick medical textbook open in his lap. While people upstairs toasted to generosity and posted photos with glowing captions, he traced dense lines of text with a fingertip, absorbing terms and patterns most adults would have struggled to follow. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one floor, wealth and power celebrated themselves. On the other, a teenage boy the world barely noticed was quietly preparing to save the man whose decisions had already cost his family everything. And if you're following this story and want to see how Benjamin's journey unfolds, make sure you hit subscribe and drop a comment with your thoughts so far. A Billionaire's Sudden Collapse. About 500 words. As the night drifted toward its peak and the last of the speeches gave way to more music and more drinks, Charles Whitfield felt a small, unwelcome flutter in his stomach. At first, it was nothing dramatic, just a subtle twist beneath his ribs that didn't match the polished confidence he was projecting. He shifted his weight, took another sip of champagne, and forced his smile to remain steady for the cameras and guests still eager to orbit around him. Rich food, long day, he told himself. Nothing more. But the feeling didn't fade. It crept, slowly and insistently, up from his gut into his chest, a strange tightness that made each breath feel just slightly off. The champagne, which had tasted smooth and expensive a few minutes earlier, now felt heavy and wrong on his tongue, like something that had turned while no one was looking. He leaned toward his personal assistant and mentioned, almost casually, that he wasn't feeling quite right. Before concern could fully form on the assistant's face, Whitfield smoothed it over with a practiced chuckle and a dismissive wave of his hand. Too much rich food, too little sleep. Occupational hazard, he joked, slipping back into his role. He had closed billion-dollar deals while jet-lagged, sick, and exhausted. A little discomfort wasn't going to knock him off script in front of donors, politicians, and media. The music swelled again and the crowd shifted, but under his crisp shirt, a thin film of sweat had begun to gather at the back of his neck. As the minutes ticked by, the mild discomfort sharpened into real pain. It felt as if invisible hands were twisting deep inside his abdomen, tightening in sudden, stabbing waves that made it harder and harder to hide what was happening. Whitfield excused himself from one conversation, then another, each time trying to keep his steps measured and his breathing steady. The hallway outside the ballroom seemed longer than he remembered, the lights harsher. He pressed one palm against the wall for a moment, just to steady himself, then forced himself upright when he heard footsteps approaching. By the time he reached a small side room meant for staff and private calls, the pain had become too intense to ignore. It radiated through his belly and into his back, hot and relentless, like something inside him was tearing itself apart. He doubled over with a low, involuntary groan, one hand clutching his abdomen, the other braced against the edge of a table. The assistant, now genuinely alarmed, hovered nearby, phone already in hand, eyes darting between Whitfield's pale face and the door. "You don't look okay, sir." "I'm calling downstairs," the assistant said, voice tight. Whitfield tried to protest, tried to regain the illusion of control, but another wave of pain crashed through him, stealing the words from his mouth. His legs trembled. The room tilted just slightly as if the floor were considering dropping out from beneath him. In that moment all the armor he wore, money, reputation, influence, meant nothing. His body didn't care how many wings of the hospital carried his name. Within minutes, a medical team was rushing him out of the ballroom area, the noise of the party fading behind them like a distant echo from another life. Guests glanced over with brief curiosity, then politely turned away, careful not to stare too long or ask questions that might make things awkward. The elevator doors slid shut on the glittering 12th floor celebration, carrying Charles Whitfield toward the same hospital system whose invisible failures had already rewritten the Turner family's life forever.